Hello, I'm Gardner Campbell, and we have an interview today with one of our featured annotators on the Engelbart Framework Annotation project, and now have gone beyond the boundaries of time and space in an even more adventurous way, because we're speaking with someone in Buenos Aires and someone whose kind of real-time, face-to-face presence I have encountered for the first time today, just a few moments before this video began. Her name is Claudia Ceraso, and I would like for her to tell us of the work she does. It's so rich and varied that I would not trust myself to be able to describe it well. And Claudia, please just share with us who you are and what you do.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for asking me to join this, because when I read the text, I thought this is difficult, but if you trust me, well, I cannot say no to the challenge. So, well, I'm Claudia Ceraso. I am a teacher of English as a foreign language. I live and learn and work in Buenos Aires, Argentina. My life is kind of divided between the big city and the small town where the family life has always been. And so I try to get the best of both worlds, right? So I keep on commuting, like 2 hours or 2 hours and a half sometime. But well, this is what I do. I just teach. I'm about to become a translator, probably in August this year. I will have finished my internship. I have already finished all my subjects. So hopefully I will divide my work on different things. I like variety.
As we've been thinking together about how we actually met in the virtual world, I have a memory I want to share with you, which has never left my mind. It's a memory of you as a teacher who appeared to me at exactly the right time in an example of the power of the internet.
Simulation.
And you remember.
Yes, of course I do. It was one of the most amazing things that has happened. Yes, but you tell the story for the viewers.
Oh my goodness, my heart is touched by the memory, and doubly touched by the fact that we share the memory and we've never talked about it before.
No, but there were a couple of blog posts, but you go ahead, you tell about it.
As I recall, I was in a meeting, maybe it was the New Media Consortium, I don't remember. I had a memory that it was as early as 2006, but that's a faulty memory, because as I recall more of it, I think it happened over Twitter because it was instantaneous. I was in a conference, I was in a room, and the discussion turned to virtual worlds. I realized that I didn't have a verb to go with simulation. I did have a verb to go with game. You play a game. But I wondered aloud on Twitter, as I do, gee, I know that you play a game. What do you do with a simulation? Claudia pops up and says, well, here are the words you can use. And you introduced me to the Oxford Dictionary of Collocations, which was a document, a book I had no knowledge of. It's designed primarily for people learning English as a second language or a third language, as another language. And I thought to myself, what have I learned here? First of all, I have learned I have an extraordinarily attentive and sympathetic colleague who has taught me something that matters most to me of all things. And I then said to myself, of course I don't know about this book. It's designed for people who do not speak English natively, but as is true with language instruction generally, if you think about the language you speak natively, as it appears to someone who does not speak it that way, you begin to learn things about your native language that you would never have known otherwise. So that memory has never left me. And I have thought often of it and of you over the years. And it occurred to me as I was reading this text, I thought there is so much in the 1962 research report, Augmenting Human Intellect, a Conceptual Framework, that concerns language. Now, who do I know who's insightful, generous, and very thoughtful about language? Your name was at the top of the list. So that is my memory of how we met.
Well, I can tell you the same memory from my side. It was an afternoon. I remember I was preparing my lessons and I had the screen with the Twitter stream there, and I saw your tweet coming up. And actually, that's the kind of question I get every day in my class. Which is the word I can say with this or that? So, and we get a little bit obsessed with it because unless you live in a community where English is spoken, you don't get that feel of the language, because sometimes you cannot explain rationally why two words go together. They simply sound right. And if you choose another one, you sound foreign. So my students have an obsession not to say the wrong thing or sound foreign. But so I have a couple of dictionaries. Actually, I will introduce you to another one. There's a BBI, Collocations Dictionary, which is much more synthetic than the Oxford. You don't get that many examples, but it's also very good. And so they were on my shelves. So I say, how strange that in order to answer a tweet, I'm going to go to my shelves to pick up a volume. And well, I just, that was fast. I tweeted it out, and I remember your answer was, I'll tell the committee or something to see if they approve of this. And I thought, where is he? What is he doing? But well, then I did not ask. And I went to my class later in the afternoon. It was at 6 p.m. And in those days, Wikispaces was up and running, remember? And there was a site I had created for my students, which was called, or it's still called in the Wayback Machine, Corpus. Because students start writing these samples for an international exam, and they are artificial realizations of a writing task. So I say, well, but you belong to a community of learners who write like that. So let's get together and you can read what my students wrote the previous year. And the collocations, all that has to do with it. So I started explaining what corpus and corpora was to my students. And then when I came back home, I was still curious about our Twitter exchange. So you had already written a blog post in which you said you had Googled about the Oxford Dictionary, and that you understood that, of course, students need the corpus and the corpora to edit these dictionaries. And then I said, this is exactly what I was trying to explain to my students, and you were in your country Googling all this. So if we can play and imagine a future, what if there had been some kind of notification that you were doing that? You would have joined my class, you know. We would have talked about corpus together, right? But maybe in future, we will be able to do something like that. Who knows? Something like giving people a link, right? Like linking to each other, not just pointing to one direction. Crazy, but it might happen one day.
No, that's a fascinating observation, because it points very clearly to one of the great, I'm searching for the word now, one of the great dilemmas, I guess, of the connected world. In some ways, we are finding here in 2019 that we are connected to a degree that is overwhelming and indeed numbing. And yet you have just articulated so beautifully a vision that I share with connection. We begin to experience what I sometimes call opt-in telepathy, which would be, you know, yes. at this moment, I so desire a connection with whatever it is that Claudia is thinking about language. Could we just turn that connection on, or could I get a notification when she thinks about that next in a way that does not invade your privacy, but that makes the opportunities for connection more available and richer? And having to steer between those two things, too much random connection that's not helpful, not enough purposeful connections that could expand our minds, that defines our life today.
Yes, and sometimes we read more and we get overwhelmed because we don't want to miss out on the important things that so-and-so could have said in his blog. But maybe in the future we could say, all right, I want to have this 10 teachers on my radar, and if they are saying anything about what we are working on now, let's connect faster and not get a spam mail or something, not that effect, but that you say, oh, serendipity. So something like magic, but more finding the structure of magic. That's what we need to find on the internet, the structure of magic.
Finding the structure of magic is a beautiful way to describe at least part of Doug Engelbart's project in 1962. He never uses the word magic. He was too much an engineer to be able to do that, I guess. But in many respects, finding the structure of magic means how can we fill our lives with more of these meaningful connections in a deliberate and mindful way. And he had a vision that you would be able to do that in a richly mediated digital computing environment. And right now, you and I are living proof of one of the best outcomes. You're a teacher. That's part of what you do as a professional. You try to multiply these experiences across many modalities. I know that. And it brings me to something else I want to say about the quality that I sensed from our interaction on Twitter that time, and certainly sense profoundly in your annotations. And it has to do, again, with this idea of connection. There's a certain bravery, not just generosity, but courage involved in wanting to be connected, because you don't have the same opportunities to filter or manipulate the presentation of self when it's happening in real time that you do when you're writing or when you are presenting. So I wonder, is that something you think about, or is it simply part of your temperament? Even in your annotations, I was so struck by your commitment to thinking aloud. It's a blogger's commitment.
Well, actually, what's an annotation, right? I mean, the voice I use to talk about these things is a blogger's voice, right? I don't have meetings with friends, except Gabriela, my edu blogger friend here, but we don't talk about these things face to face in the ELT teaching. So the voice I have developed to talk about these things is my blogger's voice, which is probably longer sentences. It's different. It's kind of different from the way you talk. And then you say, and what's an annotation? What is this supposed to be? Well, maybe it could be the same way I annotate books, that I just write a couple of words, or then I use a Post-it note for a longer paragraph. So in a sense, I was all alone with the text. I forgot for some moments that there were other people, onlookers of my annotations. And then there were times when I felt probably if I'm going to write something too long, maybe that's my blog. This is invasive. I cannot take up all this space. Let's finish the idea and then we'll see how we link to it. But then I see other people feel like chatting, maybe exchanging and answering your comments. So it's a blend of voices, this kind of online annotations. But I haven't given it much thought yet about how I've done those annotations.
The connection that I find here is that many people look at this 1962 report as an engineering report, but I find in addition to that, that's undeniably there is an extraordinary quality in which I feel I am hearing Doug Engelbart think aloud. There's a certain exploratory commitment to what he's doing that sits side by side with things he's trying to articulate very precisely in a way that the other engineers would be prepared to accept. Can you say some more about that blend of voices? Because it's, I think, an essential skill in the digital age, but we don't talk about it enough.
Well, different things in what you said. I still haven't had time to go into the diversity of styles in which Doug Engelbart is writing. I noticed that there is a diversity, but I still feel I'm just scratching on the surface of the text. And I say, okay, here's language, and I go along that path, and then there's something that connects to learning. So I still haven't gone down that meta, let's say, to see the style in which he writes, but yes, I do notice. And what strikes me as something difficult to do, that, yeah, he might be spontaneous, but still he has given it so much thought. The ideas have been going on his mind for so long before writing that he seems to be aware when he writes that one word could just make a U-turn of the whole topic, but he's keeps on track, and then maybe there will be another section for the other topic. He's aware of all the ramifications, we can say that in English, ramifications of, well, you see, this is the moment when I would double check in a dictionary if it is the word ramifications. So I think that he's trying to be precise, but he also knows that the reader must be making an effort to follow because there's so much. Yes, that was the impression I got.
That's one of the great paradoxes of language, that it's a deliberate attempt on the part of the writer to communicate, knowing that there must be a kind of answerability on the part of the reader, almost a hospitality, so that we're working together to track the original meaning, but also to bring the exploration along so that it doesn't turn into something that's merely a transaction. You're so attuned to that throughout your annotations. And at one point, I wanted to ask you about a particular annotation in which you described the process of reading Engelbart as if you were reading the narration of your own annotation at that moment. And you refer to
the writing.
and you refer to a particular author, Cortázar, I think?
Yes, Cortázar. Yes, yes. Now I found the link to add it to that annotation because it's yes, it reminded me of a short story by Cortázar, and it's one page only. So I'll add it when I think it's online and translated into good English. And the story is briefly about a reader who gets very comfortable on his armchair to enjoy a novel. The novel is about mystery. He knows there's going to be a murder, and it's two lovers plotting to murder the husband, right? So he knows that these people are deciding when to go to the house to find the victim, and they start describing a path, right, in a forest or something like that. The reader can also see a similar landscape through his window. So there's the continuity of the parts, so much so that it happens he is the husband, the reader. So then you will have to discover what happens in the story. I will put the link there. But sometimes you think you're looking at something outside of yourself, but the text comes to you. You are part of the story. So when I was reading that, I say he's describing exactly what I'm trying to do when I annotate. And so it reminded me of the story of Cortázar's continuity of the parks.
As I read your annotation about Doug Engelbart predicting the annotation that you were doing, I felt myself looping through time and memory in unusual ways. Now, I understand for some people that feels like dizziness and it's unpleasant, but for me, it's oddly comforting and oddly thrilling as well to think that as we think, or as you put it in your wonderful blog post, as we may remember, there are ways in which, as we move through experience, we seem constantly to be evading or transcending barriers of time and space. And it made the experience of thinking about the 1962 report fresh for me to read your annotation, and made me feel anew that there is an interesting kind of intimacy available to us as we read this description of the future that we're living in now. That was quite moving at that moment.
Yes, the text does not seem old. The first time I started reading, that was before I said yes to this invitation, I was struck by the word typewriter all of a sudden, because I was lost in the text and I had forgotten it was 1962. But when you see typewriter, it reminded me of a movie, I think it was called Somewhere in Time, when the man tries to time travel, but then when he's in 1912, it's a coin from the 70s and he's suddenly brought back to the present. So that mention of typewriter was like, hey, where are we? When are we? Well, it's the same time illusion when we read.
I seem, as a professor of literature, always to be trying to help students understand that this is part of the great pleasure and strangeness of the reading experience, is our ability to become unstuck and to travel more freely through our own mental and emotional landscapes.
Mm-hmm, yes, but when you publish those thoughts, well, you break a loneliness of the thinker or traveler in your own mind. Then someone else may find a rapport with that and try to connect and comment, or not, which is all right. Lurking is also okay.
So as you say this, I'm struck also by your discussion in the document of Engelbart's notion of language as a technology, which sometimes seems to provide an avenue for more connections. And sometimes, from your annotations, it seems to be an idea that you're not entirely comfortable with.
And actually, somebody answered, or technology as language, to my comments. So it's great to explore one avenue and then to shift completely. Yes, well, of course, learning, the learning experiences we have are social, right? But what I'm not comfortable with is to say that if we don't socialize, learning doesn't take place. I wouldn't be able to affirm that. So then I start exploring, why do we think it's social, or who probably could give some arguments about that not being social. But it's just my thoughts. If any viewer of this gets the impression I'm researching on that, no, it's just a thought. So yes, I have studied a lot of Chomsky in linguistics, because that's part of the teacher training, the teacher of English training. So I do tend to feel comfortable with his ideas of innatism, right? That he says that language is, we mature. As we mature, we develop our language. So the word acquisition, or first language acquisition, could be directly misleading you into thinking that it's something there and you acquire, as if you could buy it with your credit card, right? So all of the learning is not necessarily happening like that. Now, in my connection to Doug Engelbart's text, I'm a student. It's new to me. I had never heard of Doug Engelbart before you mentioned him. So I'm trying to enter the text, and of course, I started noting every mention of language to see if we were talking about the same thing. I assume not. He's an engineer. I'm a language teacher. We have different purposes to approach language. So I thought that it was interesting to explore first what is different between us, and then to see what can be a link. Mm-hmm.
It is a question that I ask every one of our featured annotators. What do you think about when you're annotating? How do you select something to annotate? And I notice that indeed, as you're going along, there are annotations that seem to be almost bookmarks. I need to know more. This is a thing I need to return to. And there are annotations that are very much thinking aloud, and there are annotations that are coming from a framework of, this is what I know, this is what I have learned, how does this match up or not match up with what Engelbart is doing? And again, there's this fascinating blend, a memory aid all the way up to something that is born of training and expertise, with everything in between. How do you manage that as you go along? It's a blend that I encourage my students to experiment with, but they seem only to be able to imagine one or maybe two ways to interact with the text.
You mean because I'm a student and I'm trying to read an expert on another field? You mean because of that? Well, how do I manage that? Now I need to think aloud here. I think that there will always be something in common. Well, language and technology, and then I see what I can learn from it. But I wonder, I mean, you find value in these contributions, which makes me very glad. But at first, I'm not sure if they will be valuable or connected, if other annotators come from systems, computers, engineering, whether they will find any echo in what I say. But maybe it's just about that. It's like a puzzle. There are different pieces, and something is going to come out of that. I think that these weeks probably a start, because perhaps in I don't know, days time, weeks time, you say, oh, but there was something that I read there and you need to go back to it. And it makes sense there and then, and not in the weeks that you had planned for the annotation. But it's what happens to teachers, right? The aha moment, the epiphany will happen when it happens. You can't have control over that. So at first, I think it's a question of trying to be self-confident and to overlook a certain barrier that says, wow, this is engineering and I'm a teacher of English, so what? What am I doing here? Well, maybe there's something I should be doing here. Let's trust that blindly, and then you go along. That's, I think, how I manage it.
That question of trust is an enormous question. And I am honored to think that you would trust me enough, even on the basis of our fairly limited contact, that you would think I'm not trying to trap you, I'm not trying to do anything other than be in a fruitful and generous exchange. But it seems difficult to spread that kind of trust. And
Mm-hmm.
I'll return again to this computing environment that we now inhabit here in 2019, which is in many respects different even from the computing environment that you and I inhabited when we first met. How do you think about, in your own work as a teacher, in your own work as a thinker, this idea of trust?
Self-reliance, in Emerson's word, right? Emerson would talk about that. I think you can only model that to students by sharing your learning experiences, right? So you have to break this myth that the teacher knows more and the students know less and they are trying to level up with you. No, I try to show them that I'm a learner. Sometimes, when I can, when the plan fits, I show them exchanges on Twitter or something that somebody commented on a blog or that I commented, look, I learned from so-and-so. So they see you as a learner. It's essential. It brings you to a human level, let's say, because sometimes the students tend to admire the teacher, which is natural. That's when you think of students in secondary school, but I also have a background from teaching adults in company lessons to managers, right? And there's something I discovered there years ago. I started teaching 25 years ago in companies. And in lesson 1, 2, 3 maximum, in a one-to-one lesson, the student would interrupt my plan and start talking about something he's an expert on and teach me something about his work. And sometimes I thought, well, but will I get to unit 3 by this time? And then you have to relax. And I think that this leveling up of the learning ground, like exchanging, you teach me, I teach you, is important. And it's probably something like that is going on every time we really learn something that's going to remain with us. Not a bit of information you memorized for the test, you did it and dropped. I think that learning happens both ways. This takes me back to the dual link I was imagining a few minutes ago. Learning is two-way. The stimulus, the trigger, then it's individual, of course. I remember my ideas. I don't want to contradict myself, but yes, you have to show them that you learn as well, and then you demystify the situation. Anyone can reach there.
One of the things that constantly appears in Doug's 1962 report, which he learned from Vannevar Bush, is this idea of associative trails. And in many respects, what you're describing is a commitment to the value of associative trails, though you may not know what will appear at the end of the trail. It's the trail exploration itself that is vitally connected with this idea of learning. So Engelbart constantly seems to me to be describing a vision of making these associative trails useful and followable and available to us after the fact. Is that something that you were thinking about as you annotated the document, that you yourself were creating even more associative trails?
This reminds me of two things. Number one, when I write my blog posts, I never know how they are going to end. Because maybe I detour and I say, no, this is better than what I had originally thought, but I don't plan them as you plan an essay or something you hand in to a teacher. So yes, these associations go on and on, right? And the other thing I remember is something you said in your blog long ago, and I think I quoted it in my blog. You said that education should lead us to longer and longer trails of thought, right? And now I understand where your ideas were coming from. Yes, for some people and some teachers, sometimes these conversations fall flat in a way, because what shall I do in class? How does this translate into a technique, a method? Solve me next lesson's plan, right? And we don't know, but definitely a tweet 10 years ago is deeply connected to this conversation now. So, but well, people don't spend 10 years in secondary school, so we need to try to to achieve something in a shorter time. But learning, genuine learning, is a continuous thing, is something that you commit yourself to it. I think that as teachers, we are more professional learners than trying to teach something. What do we know? The world is changing faster than our knowledge. So it takes you to a humble place, right? So again, showing the student that you are also on a path, sometimes parallel, sometimes we cross, touch, hyperlink to what you're learning, and showing them that way with connections. I remember now, some time ago, Alan Levine has a story that's called Domino. Remember the pictures of Domino? And I thought I would like to use this in my class, but I don't want the students to know exactly what's going on. So I showed it to my students, and we started brainstorming in class, seeing the pictures in an interactive whiteboard. One of the best uses of the interactive whiteboard is to show Alan Levine's pictures. And so they were imagining things, and I said they coincide with many things of what the story actually says, which I will reveal later. But also, Alan used to write several blog posts about that dog, Domino, and things that had happened outside the story, and the students were able to touch on those elements just by seeing the pictures, and they wrote their own Domino stories. And then I sent them all to Alan. I said, this is strange. I mean, how could they know this? It's all in the pictures. What is it? It was magic. So Alan was very generous too, to write a blog post about it, something that was called Domino Stories Coming from Argentina. So the next class, I had Alan's blog post projected on the interactive whiteboard, and the students were, what's that? Well, look, the author of the story is talking to you. He reads you and he talks to you. So that was a fantastic class, right? So you have to establish those links and to tell them there's not a writer of the story, a reader of the story. Things could mix, right? As in the Cortázar story.
Engelbart, following the Whorf hypothesis, thinking about general semantics and so forth, is very committed to the idea that new ways of structuring and sharing symbols will lead to new ways of thinking, or richer ways of thinking. Do you find in your own experience of using computers in all these different ways that it has somehow changed or enriched or somehow affected how you're able to think?
Yes, definitely, because I've always loved to write as a diary, for example, but sharing online and finding someone else's comment and ideas on how these ideas mix with their own thinking when they quote you and link to you and they take the idea further, yes, that has led me to think in ways I had not imagined I would. Perhaps I would not be reflecting on these things because who do you talk to about that? So there's a world out there, and that goes back to the issue of trust. Write it, publish it, because someone somewhere will be connected to that idea. So we still cannot make those meaningful connections faster. It still takes a long time to do some sifting and reading through blogs and publications until you find that echo. But maybe in future we will be able to tag faster to each other. Who knows?
I would be very interested in hearing you think aloud about what seemed to Engelbart the reason to do all of this, which was to help us think better individually and collectively and address urgent social problems in a more effective way.
Well, it sounds like the world is too big. How to solve the problems of the world, right? One class at a time. I mean, you just make these connections and you hope students can copy the processes, not your conclusions, right? So that they can also say, okay, there's a friendly voice out there. In my case, to also make them confident that they can think aloud and establish these connections, even though they're not speaking their mother tongue. So that's the extra challenge, the meta challenge, right? What to say and how to say it, and am I saying it correctly or not? So when I find that students are fluent with these conversations, that's great. I haven't explored much in my lessons to connect them to native speakers through Skype or something, but I'm sure they would be confident about that. But then they have to find their passion. They would not blog or connect with my own ideas. I try not to direct them to any idea. I try to see whether they find their own ways to make their own world better. They are sharing in class. In general, my students, I teach at a language school. So it's not a secondary school. They choose to go there to go deeper in the knowledge of the language. So they come from all walks of life, and sometimes they're not exactly the same age. So sharing and finding the conversation together, that's already establishing bridges. But well, then you just have to use the internet as a bridge and connect anywhere.
Which would bring me to the next question. As you think about using the internet to build bridges, using the internet to make those connections, do you think that the culture of computer usage in Argentina matches that you see in the United States, or diverges from it significantly, or somewhere in between? How would you compare those two cultures?
The use of the internet, I mean, well, here we have our logistical problems. There's not that much investment, so every new phone line, everything is connected to the same infrastructure, so it creates slowness. That's one of our challenges. Today, people, I think they connect mostly in mobile ways. So I'm amazed that my students just use email to create user accounts because they need the verification link. That's all. So sometimes I have to remind them, hey, there's an email that I sent with the information you need, because they prefer to ask me in WhatsApp. So there's the group of the class, and they drop the question there. Someone will answer, hey, there's an email. So I don't know if our use of the internet matches the use in the States, but eventually we all have the same connectivity needs. They go along the lines of, let's get there faster, which I don't know if that always equals better. You need to do more things in less time, you're overwhelmed. Well, I wonder whether that was the dream of the pioneers when they thought we will be connected, but the tempo, the pace of life and the demands of the working world are that you manage this fast, efficiently, and get better results. And everything we are trying to do, reflecting, is lingering on the process. So to some people, they might as well think it is a loss of time. I don't. But the connectivity need, I think, is taking us to the same place. You don't want to feel isolated. You want to feel human, not a machine just responding. We all have that need. So eventually, I think question of time, everyone can sense to these ideas. Maybe not reading Doug Engelbart, maybe through somewhere else and down another path or road. But we need to feel human about using these things.
So let's think about this aspect of time.
Mm-hmm.
In many ways, our experience of language is enriched by and encouraged by this idea of fluency, that we don't have to search for words, we don't have to struggle with vocabulary or grammar, case, or any of those things. We simply think it and we say it. On the other hand, we invent all of these ways of communicating fruitfully that do demand us to slow down with our fluency and think quickly but reflect more deliberately. So I'm so struck by what you say, that there is something about connections that also has an element of slowness in it, or something more deliberate in it. So I would love to hear you think, especially as a language teacher, about this interesting dilemma, if I can call it that, between very low latency, very ease of use in a language, but at the same time, never becoming so easy with language that you stop being able to reflect on what you're saying.
Well, that's the subject of my lessons again. Students always wonder, when will I be able to speak more fluently? When will I, right? It's managing certain levels of frustration. When I was learning, and I still could not speak fluently, when I was first learning English, I started when I was 12 or so. I had the dream of being able to speak the way I can do today fluently, and not think of translations. I'm thinking in English. I'm not going to a Spanish word and then back to my idea in English. Actually, it would be difficult to translate it into Spanish. It would take me time to translate myself into Spanish. I tried with blog posts and I said, it's too much work, leave it in English. I thought about it in English. And students want to get there fast sometimes. When they are advanced enough to have the whole class in English without resorting to translation, you can define the words you're using in English, then they get a grasp of the time it takes and they relax into it. To notice that you have advanced when your knowledge is just saying who you are, introducing yourself, or where's the supermarket, your mind seems to jump. You realize that you know a lot more. But when you're an advanced student, you may be advancing, the teacher notices, but the student is still hungry for more. Right? So it's all about managing levels of frustration and acceptance that it will take the time it will take. Part of it matures in you. Knowledge sort of sinks in its own time. And you cannot say the test is tomorrow and I learn it overnight. So with languages, that's very evident. So yes, there is a wanting to get there faster, but sometimes it's not possible.
And your remarks lead me to wonder about the farthest edges of Engelbart's vision, which, as I see it, involves learning yet another language, which is the language not of programming necessarily, but the language of thinking in more complexly and richly structured concepts that are only possible to share within the medium of computing, because the computer is able to track things we're unable to keep in our memories and to preserve them for our inspection in very rapid and various ways. At some point, we may find, and sometimes, perhaps I'm kidding myself, sometimes I get a feeling for this, that I have just thought in terms that are the language of this network. And I don't know how I would express it in English or any other language. There are thoughts available to me only when I am in this medium. And I wonder, have you had that experience? And do
Yes,
you?
I do.
Well, so talk about that.
Yes, I do. Yes, sometimes I don't stop much to write about that, but yes, sometimes I realize that my writing or the lines I'm trying to follow in my blog are deeply influenced by something I've read. I'm trying to take a distance from that and go back to it. So yes, the tool or the medium rather shifts the way you think, and then probably we should create new words for the things we are doing, but they would be foreign words for those who are not participating or using language in this context, right? As a technical term from another field, right? I was looking for a word in one of the first blog posts I wrote in connection with these annotations. So what's the word when you know that something there is the concept you need, but it doesn't have a name, right? And then I found this word apperception, which is something more global, more instinctual. You know, as if it were an instinct, that what you're looking for is there. You're confident because you have been clicking around for a while and you know you're confident is along that path. So all that process has a name. If we start describing step by step what we do, we don't get further. We're just at that description level. But if we give a concept, a name to all that we are doing, well, our minds would jump and our thoughts would go faster, wouldn't they?
And by the way, your blog post on apperception, I've already used. It's there is a word. So there's a debate about whether language is the result of thought or thought is the result of language. And it sounds to me almost as if you would say that language is the result of thought, that there's something about thought or the intuitive leaps our minds are able to make that precedes even the language we would have to describe it.
There have been some, I don't know, a myth probably. Sometimes people think, oh, German is the perfect language for philosophy, for example, the tool and the content. But I don't think there are any studies that can prove that. We like to think that language and thought and which develops which are connected in a certain way, right? Definitely they are connected, but I don't know if we can tell still how they are connected, because we have a collection of studies. Neuroscience has advanced incredibly in the last 20 years, and probably they have doubled the knowledge that humanity had reached before. But we still don't have one single theory of the brain. So we don't know how people learn. We don't know what language is. We don't know how a sentence is transformed from active to passive in your brains. We still don't have the microscope, to mention a tool, to watch how that's happening. So it's all theories. I think it could be either way. Language affects the thought, and the thought then language, because you start creating at least vocabulary items to talk about the concepts. But then the structure of what comes with us innately, as we are born, our capacity to learn language, probably that would change very slowly, not in a lifetime, but in several million years.
And Engelbart's vision was that if you could find the appropriate spot for intervention, you would be able to accelerate certain kinds of capacity evolution.
One of the things you sense about Doug Engelbart's report is he seems to be able to express himself fully. He's not searching for a word, so that is what he wanted to say. Then it's up to us to decode the message, but it seems a mind at peace that he has expressed what he meant, right? So that's the first augmentation we should find, at least to express yourself fully in a language, right?
Your phrase, a mind at peace, is just deeply moving. I I'm doing research right now on the various drafts of that 1962 report to try to find that set of trails, that process to look at the evolution of a mind thinking about itself in ways that are so strange and almost inexplicable to the people he would interact with. And I get such a strong sense of exactly what you've said, that whatever its omissions, whatever its flaws, when you get to the 1962 report, Engelbart knows he has said what he tried to say, and to at least as much of an extent as any of us can have as human beings, this is a mind at peace. He has said what he has thought, and there it is. That's
to change the world. That's what Doug told you, right? Now you have to go out, change the world.
You've certainly changed my world, Claudia. You've done it again yet today. It's a recursive process, a friendship. I look forward to our next conversation. Thank you so very much for sharing yourself with us.
Thank you so much for asking. Thank you for this interview. And yes, it's a deal. It will not be the last time. This conversation is the first chapter. Okay?
I'm counting on it.
All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.